Welcome to episode 28 of the World Builder's Anvil. Today's topic, fantasy culture, arts, dress, and architecture. Don't know where to start building your fantasy world? Do you need more? Does it make sense? Forget any worries and become a crafter of imagination. This is the place that will help prime your mind. Now, it's time to heat up the forge, break out the mithril ingots and hammer. Welcome to the World Builder's Anvil. I'm your host, Jeffrey W. Ingram. Let's sup from the mug of Java and build. Welcome back, and once again, I'm your host, Jeffrey W. Ingram, and thank you for joining me for today's topic on fantasy culture, arts, dress, and architecture. Now, you might have realized I talked a little about dress in my cultural fashion show. However, I'm just going to cover that again here briefly. And as always, remember to please subscribe, rate, and review us on iTunes. That helps our shows stay out there. It helps people find and connect with it. And hopefully can provide them some value like it's provided you in listening to this show. Now, the first thing to understand is when I talk about cultural art, dress, and architecture, this is a very specific thing before a culture becomes part of a state or states. At that time, the state will kind of override it a little bit for the culture. If a culture is spread into multiple states and has, in those states, different cultures attached to it, over time, the dress will deviate a bit. However, it's still very important early on. And remember, once again, I consider it a culture until it's large enough to start expanding territory, essentially through the tribal age. Even if it's agricultural, I keep thinking of it as a culture until there's really a society, a state formed within it. First thing I want to talk about a little bit here is symbology. Symbology is very important when you talk about art, even dress, and architecture. The kind of things that are going to show up as recurring themes within a culture are going to derive from the symbology of the culture. Some of that's going to come from religion. Some of it's going to come from the culture itself. However, those kinds of symbols that are important are going to show up time and time again. In Christian nations, think of a cross. Very popular. You see it all over. Certain types of headwear and different kinds of religions are important. And sometimes it needs to be plain, and sometimes, you can have an ornament version. So in theory, you could have a culture that has to wear a headpiece, but let's say there's no limitations of what it needs to look like. It has to be something specific. You might have very highly ornate versions of that when it comes to people who can afford it as a way of proving their wealth. However, typically if a religion is more about submission to a god or an idea, then it's probably more likely that when you're dealing with religion, people should be acting submissive to the religion. That's just something to think about. The symbology is very important, whether it's a cross, whether it is a wedding ring, might not exist in all cultures. However, it's very important in many cultures on earth today. But if it is, how do they make it? And a lot of this will go into geography. Geography will tell you the common and uncommon materials that are available to a culture group. And that will determine what the cloth is made out of, what the buildings are made out of. If there's a lot of marble, you'll probably see more marble buildings. If there's no marble, you might still see some marble buildings, but they'll be confined to really wealthy, really important structures to the culture. So types of materials for clothing, whether it be grown like cotton or if it's taken from nature, from a certain kind of weed or a natural fiber somewhere that can be rewoven into clothing. Perhaps it's animal furs. Whatever's available to the culture, they're going to adapt as the base level of clothing. Uncommon things to that culture will generally start translating to clothing for the wealthy. Let's say you have a northern barbarian horde people who dress in furs. Once they start expanding out and perhaps trading with neighbors who have access to cotton or linens of some form, you might start seeing the nobility start to adopt maybe not the same style of clothing, but that material transformed into something for that culture. Or if the culture really has a impressive view of the culture it's trading with, they might actually adapt a bit of the clothing from that culture as well too. However, more often than not, you're going to take the material and rework it in a way that make sense to the symbology and what's commonly accepted and understood in the culture. Materials for building, same idea. Whether you're making mud bricks all the way up through cement, steel, structures, wood structures, what is the resource that's common? If you have no wood, you're highly unlikely to have a lot of woodworking in the area. So you're going to have less wood structures. You might have less wood support within structures. It might even make structures more expensive to build, but possibly more enduring. So in a place like Egypt where they would use stone to build things or mud bricks, the stone structures have lasted a very long time. The mud brick structures kind of come and go as the flooding allows. Same thing in the U.S. You take a lot of the homes we have in the U.S. today, a lot of them aren't built for endurance. They have a high level of maintenance. So you figure if for some reason the population in the U.S. all moves out tomorrow and no one else moves into the area, probably in a generation, 30 years or so, most of the homes are collapsed. And that's just a guess on my part. But I'd say around 30 years, they're all going to be collapsed because the way they're built isn't meant for endurance unless you have people that are maintaining it. So types of clothing are important. Do they wear pants? Is it a tunic? And the best thing to think of for the types of clothing you're going to adopt is one, what are the materials available to the people? And the other thing is, what is the climate? The climate plays a huge role in it too. You're not going to wear heavy furs, even if there are a lot of furs available if you live in a desert environment because, well, you'll be too hot. So what kind of material will make you comfortable? What kind of material is available? And what kind of material is important to the culture? And due to religious reasons or some sort of cultural tradition, certain materials might be really valued in a culture, or maybe it's strictly just what's available. The color. Color is something that's often played an important role in clothing. You think of the Phoenicians, the purple people of the Mediterranean. They can make purple dye. Purple became associated, I believe, with nobility through Europe because of its difficulty to make. If this one group that could make it, it made them very wealthy because that dye was coveted by very rich people across the world. Where something like a blue or a red is a little bit more common. And what you might get into too is, depending on the pigments available, pigments might also help dictate your place in society. It depends on how important that is to a society. They might want to be able to walk around and say, hey, this guy has no color, he's poor. This guy has some red, he's a little bit wealthier. He has some blue, he's very wealthy. He has purple, he is nobility. And maybe you don't use the colors that way. It depends on what pigments are available to your people. Remember, pigments aren't necessarily always something derived from animals or plants. They're sometimes derived from soaking stuff in earthen materials too, like think of the red clay of the Tennessee Valley area. That will stain clothing forever. So if you have that around, cultures might actually find a way to create a dye from that that's a little bit more consistent when applied to a material. Clasp. How do things hold together? Are they tied off? Do they snap? Are there buttons? A lot of it depends on what's available to the culture through technology or magic. But that's the important thing to think about because that adds detail if you're describing the way someone looks. And if they're of a different culture than the hero in your story, the hero might notice that how is there no tie? Why does he not have a belt? He might notice things that are common in his culture that aren't common in the other culture. So he's going to see the differences and it's going to stick out in the mind of the character and they're more likely to think about it. It makes more sense to describe it. But I also like little details too because little details will tell you what is important to a culture. If someone has a tie-on pants and they see someone with tie-on pants, they're probably not going to think about it. It would be more awkward to share that information from the point of view of a character. At least in that kind of situation. Maybe they're more annoyed because the tying isn't going the way it normally does in the morning. There are other ways to describe it, but what's important, how do the clothes clasp together? Do they have brooches? Overalls? How do they hold the clothes to their body? What kind of accessories? We'll talk a lot about a culture too. And some of these accessories might be artisan goods like pottery. If I use pottery to gather water, bring it back to my house, pottery will be a common thing to see with people. However, if they're in an area where there's no pottery, well, they might have animal skins instead. Or they might use animal skins anyway because their ability to make temperature controlled things in an animal skin might be better than their ability to do it in pottery. So what's important to the culture? What's available? What kinds of jewelry do they have? Do they put ornamental things in their hair? Do they wear ornaments about their body? It could be, once again, back to the pigment, maybe it's tattoos. You see this is very common right now in fantasy with woads on people's faces due to certain cultures that actually do that. Very common in primitive tribal cultures in certain areas to have tattoos or paint on their face to indicate certain things. The difference between the paint and the tattoo is the permanency of it. The best way to think about architecture is what inspires the people. What is the thing that drives them forward in the day to survive and to get their culture a little bit more advanced? Whether it's from individual basis or from a purely cultural basis, depending on the group, what is the thing that pushes them forward? What's important to them? This is going to lead you into the next part, which is important structures. Perhaps religion is important, but it's not structurally important. Or maybe the structures aren't temples like you think about them in Greece or in most of the Mediterranean, where you have these giant temples that are all over every major city. But maybe it's more like the Persians that would just have these shrines out in the middle of nowhere, when other cultures did that too. So what are the important structures? Is there a meeting place for the culture? If they're more of a democratic style culture, more of a republic style culture, they're going to need a little bit larger meeting structure for everyone to come together to have discussions and vote. Is there an acropolis? Is there a castle? What are the important structures? The more important structures, the more impressive the architecture is going to get faster. Because if I find a temple important towards my culture, when we start getting access, we're going to want to put effort towards doing that. And that's maybe why you end up with the Stonehenge in certain areas, but not in other areas, because the Stonehenge was really important. The astrological viewing, the religious purposes, whatever it was exactly used for, was more important than other things. So they worked very early in that culture in Britain and in the other megalith areas to build these stones to do something, and they still stand today. Same with the tombs in Egypt, the Great Wall in China, castles in Europe, if they weren't blown up in later wars. These things are all what are important structures. And when you have important structures, you have to understand what they're used for, what's the purpose and the effect towards the cultural norms. And once again, materials, I'm not going to go into this a lot again, but is it stone? Is it wood? What do they have? Once again, the more important the structure, the more likely it is to be put in an enduring state. Unless the culture, due to their norms, does not like permanence. Let's say that they're traveling, they're nomadic. They're not going to really put up permanent structures, or they're less likely to. Arts usually come out of a way of differentiating goods and services, especially goods. So, the best place is to look at all the wonderful pottery that people see and put a lot of money into from antiquity. Usually it was to say who made it or to help make the pots stick out a little bit more. It was not typically considered of great value at the time it happened. It was of minor value. It was to give you a little edge in selling your goods. It wasn't looked at like it is today. So usually it comes out of necessity. And once again, it's going to be based off of things that are important to the culture. If pottery is really important, maybe you have different kinds of pots for different kinds of purposes. You have pots that go out in front of people, pots that are more for moving stuff around. You're more likely to have important artwork done on those because it's a way for the potter to advertise his goods. And then over time, as a culture develops, especially into a state, arts are going to start to transform more away from really marketing, more into what we think of as art today, as these non-utilitarian ways of looking or listening to the world. And what's going to be based on materials? What materials are available to the culture? Is it stone? Is it wooden weeds? Is it mud? Is it metals? Is it pigment and paints? Look to see what's available to the culture. Look to the cultural norms to say what's important. Is it permanency? Is endurance important? Is moving around important? That's going to dictate the kinds of art and the arts you're going to show up. Very, very important. If you're nomadic, you're not having big statues you're looking around. Unless you have a way to do it, that's possibly addressed by magic or by wagons or whatever giant beast in your world that can be used to pull giant wagons. Maybe then you could have a bit more permanent, larger structures. But you have to think about what's important to the culture. If it's not important for them to stay in one area and endure there, they're probably less likely to have art that endures. Maybe they have little sand art that blows away when they're gone. They just draw it into the sand. Maybe they do it for religious purposes. Maybe they do it because there's a game wrapped around it. Who knows why it's done? You should know as you develop it, but usually there's some utilitarian angle to it early on in a culture. And as the culture has more and more success and is less worried about survival, you can start breaking into arts that are done for non-utilitarian reasons. Common goods versus uncommon goods. And once again, this will talk about what is important to a culture. Usually rare items are more valuable, like gold or precious gems on earth are more valuable than Tennessee clay. There's a lot of Tennessee clay, but Tennessee clay is an important good in the area, but gold is worth more because it's more precious to the people who live there. And so you have to think about that based off the cultural norms of your society. The last one to think about is the mouth. How do they make sounds? Are there ways that they can make sounds that are pleasant to people? Singing, poems, whatever, typically early on poems are very important in a culture. Meter is very important because it helps things get remembered over time before you can write. The earlier you have writing, the earlier you can break away from the importance of prose in a language. However, the longer a language goes on not written down with no alphabet, the more important prose will become, because if you're learning Homer's epic poems, you have to be able to say them word for word. It will take a long time to learn them, and the meter will help you get to the next word, especially as you become more suited to it. You can't deviate from the stories, and maybe over time there still is a deviation. You don't want to play phone with your culture's myths. They're very important, and they're going to remain important. If you want a group that meters important, give them a traditional basis of a long time without written word. It makes it much, much more important. But the mouth will always be important. The way you communicate to each other, and if you communicate in a different way, let's say you have no vocal cords, but you can do language through sign language, you're probably going to come up with ways there too to once again make it simpler to remember, make it simpler to say. And from that, art will drive over time. Are there more pleasant ways to wave the arm? The rating for this episode is basic. This is a basic topic. You need to know the arts, dress, and architecture of your cultures. The world building task for the day. Look at the arts, dress, and architecture for your culture and your latest work in progress and ask yourself, does it make sense to the materials that are available to them? If not, can I come up with rules to make it make sense? But you really need to think about how and why they're being used. The real world to task for the day. When you're working, close down your email and social media. And this sounds simple, but people don't do it. And you'll see a notification pop up. It interrupts your train of thought. Whenever I'm actually planning a show or recording a show, I'll mute my phone. I'll go to my social media tab and I'll close down the tab. I'll close down my email tab. And I might check it occasionally during the day. But I try and limit the times of the day I do that to when my brain's a little less active, and I can put the more active brain towards the more creative tasks that I'm trying to get done, the more complicated tasks I'm trying to get done. And then I can deal with email and social media at a different point. The tease for the episode is fantasy racial traits. And as always, make sure to go to gardul.com. That's GARDUL.com for the show notes. It'll be under podcasting. World Builders Anvil. That's a great place to get all of the information from the episode that you've just listened to and to see all the resources that we've talked about in this episode. Thanks for joining us this episode of the World Builders Anvil. Please be sure to rate and review us in iTunes, and please help get the word out to your friends about our show. And join me, Jeffrey W. Ingram at Gardul.com, to see the progress of my world and learn why I made the choices I did. And please contact me and let me know the topics you would love to hear in the future. Now strike while the myth rolls high.